Welcome to another special episode of Not Quite Right.
The specialist
episode. My name is Ed.
And I'm Amanda.
And this is the shortlist episode of the April 2024 Not Quite Right prize. So another action-packed episode. We've got 3 remaining daredevils, but one of them is actually in the shortlist. So who will it be? We'll start off with our 2 other daredevils, and then we'll move on to our wildcard entries and our shortlist and our winner. And we talked about this in our long list episode, which we literally just finished recording. But this was a really difficult decision to arrive at these 6 shortlisters and 2 wildcards.
And that's not bullshit. That's not us saying that to save anyone's feelings. Like, it legit was back and forth.
We've been going over this for days trying to work out which stories made it through. So if you missed out, just bear in mind that you probably came very close.
And if you did purchase a critique, we'll be able to tell you that.
Yeah, we'll tell you exactly why.
Yeah, and you may not want to hear it. I don't know. You might curse us forevermore if you just dropped off the list. But it gives you the opportunity to at least have insight into why we made that decision and the opportunity to curse us for that.
Speaking of cursing us, let's get on to our 2 daredevils. So these are people who have paid for the privilege of being roasted by us on the podcast.
Fools. So our first daredevil that we're going to be reading today is The Single Parent's Guide to Leveling Up Your Teenager on a Budget by Jaden Christopher. On his 15th birthday, Henry's mother Susan parked their old rusty Subaru at the Government Growth Day Centre, then loosened the straps holding Henry down to the roof. She knew people didn't approve. Not even 50 years ago she would have been lapidated. But strapping down was the current accepted method for the transportation of growing teenagers for people of Susan's status. Susan scanned the parking lot for her usual friends, Katie and Leslie, who would be here today as well. Both were single mums like Susan. "Go ahead, honey," whispered Susan, tousling Henry's hair. Henry ran ahead to check in with the other kids as Susan spotted Katie walking up. "Susan!" exclaimed Katie. "Where is Leslie today?" asked Susan. "Didn't you hear? Her new husband got them a birthday room." "Seriously? What a bitch!" Susan could barely afford rent, never mind a steel-encased padded room that was only used once a year. Too bad, her kid was due for a huge growth spurt, and I could use $5. Henry will probably take it again. What does Emma want? Emma wants boobs this year, but not much hope there. Katie patted her flat chest with both hands. "Yeah, Mum hated these," Susan quipped, groping her breasts. "I needed new bras 3 years in a row. Henry just wants to grow wider. He grew 6 inches taller last time. He better get his wish. If he grows any taller, hand-me-downs won't fit anymore. He's going to be going to school in crop tops and capris. Yeah, I don't know what I'll do if they pass that gene therapy law, allowing everyone to grow slowly over the year instead of all at once." "How would you even budget for that?" replied Katie. "God, just imagine dealing with all that teen angst and anger all the time. Better to just get it over with," Susan remarked, shaking her head. The 2 women walked into the waiting room, the massive steel doors of the growth room spanning out in front of them like bank vaults. Bangs and screams emanated from the rooms as the teenagers grew and changed. The muffled noise made Susan feel good about how much safer things had gotten. "Mum!" yelled Henry. Susan turned as Henry ran from his growth room. His belly button was now exposed underneath his way too short white t-shirt. "Shit," muttered Susan. Katie nudged Susan, chuckling. "Looks like I won this year." "Yeah, great," replied Susan, handing Katie a $5 bill. "Sorry, I might have a spare gift card too." Katie stopped as Emma walked out of her steel room, smiling from ear to ear. While she hadn't gotten any taller, her white shirt looked eerily similar to Henry's, exposing her belly button. "Damn it," cursed Katie. "Let's call this one a draw," Susan joked as she grabbed the $5 back from Katie. "I'll take you up on the gift card, and we can stop at my house on the way. I probably have some bras I can spare."
So thanks, Jaden, for the story. I just wanted to add the brief explanation that Jaden gave at the start of the story. So he says, This story was meant to answer the question, what if humans leveled like characters in an RPG, a role-playing game? How would they deal with growing an entire year in a 10-minute span? Hopefully the short word count does it justice. So that was the premise of the story. I think the connection to an RPG wouldn't have been apparent to me without that explanation. Our listeners would have just heard that story without the context of the brief explanation. So it'd be interesting to know what they thought.
I knew it was some sort of game, right? I got that, like leveling up and so on. But I didn't understand why a role-playing game and not like a Super Mario kind of level game.
Just in role-playing games, level ups are generally things that you purchase.
Okay.
You know, my character needs a new suit of armor or increased strength. And I think that's a parallel being drawn here. Like you live in a society where that's part of life. You've got to buy things like growing up. Yeah. And I think that's an interesting idea. Like if the government / corporations could stop people from growing and charging them for it, that would happen.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They would if they could.
Yeah.
And I did actually make that note when I first read this story, and we didn't know which ones were daredevils or not when we were going through and making our notes, but I literally wrote, this story idea has legs. Probably super long legs by the end. But no, but it's got legs. Like it's interesting. It's intriguing. It's different. I've never come across this kind of idea before. And I really like that about it. It is fun and fresh when you're reading a bunch of stories, and that does stand out to you like, oh, what's this? That's quite a juicy concept that has a lot of potential. And I will say that it held me pretty captivated throughout. I'm like, what is going on here? And this is interesting. One thing I would challenge about this story is that there's the potential for, but not a lot of conflict, right? So there's this bet that's going on.
Yep.
But it's low stakes. It's $5. And I mean, $5 might mean more in this story, but that's never explored. So we just give $5 the same value we would have now, unless we're sort of given a reason to understand it otherwise. I did feel like there was an opportunity here to make it feel a bit more dystopian or something.
Yeah,
like
definitely.
Not necessarily that I'm arguing for a dystopian story, but that we did need some sense of stakes or conflict that would bring this really home. I mean, there's these moments where you're like walking down these bank vault like rooms and you're just hearing these bangs and screams. That's pretty creepy. And yet it's just brushed over, and then we're back joking about whether someone's going to come back with boobs. So there's, don't make me say it, like the Poe single effect thing again. Like, which is it? Is it a comedy? And it does read as a comedy to me. Or is it this dystopian creepy thing? And it has the potential to be a comedy while also being creepy, but I think that needs to be clear. I think you need to be direct with what you're going for there.
Yeah, and I think it's, as he says in the brief explanation, it's like a lighthearted exploration of this idea and what might happen.
Yeah, and that's great, but I think if you want to win a flash fiction competition, then you need to not just explore an idea, but evolve a story from that idea and engage us in that story and make us feel connected.
Yeah, it comes down to those same things that we always talk about. We talk about character, we talk about stakes, developing a story leading into an ending that is satisfying and is a payoff for the story. So all of those elements really need to be there, whether you're telling a lighthearted story or whether you're telling something that is more dystopian.
So just on that idea of Poe's single effect, I'd like to come right back to the title of this story. So the title of the story was The Single Parent's Guide to Leveling Up Your Teenager on a Budget. Now, that implies a hermit crab fiction to me, that title. It feels like it's going to be a guide now, right? But actually what follows is a story.
Yeah.
And so I did feel there was a disconnect for me, like the expectation wasn't met. You've set up an expectation that this is going to be a guide or a hermit crab, and then I've gone into a story.
I don't know. I think there's the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy example as a lighthearted sci-fi. And it might be kind of an indirect reference to that. But I can see that you might have that expectation.
I guess the other thing about that title is that it calls out single parents, right? So there's a few things going on here. So leveling up your teenager, that part is clear to me in this story. Yep. On a budget is something that is touched on but not really fully seen through to a conclusion. So we have this idea of some rich bitch who's got her own birthday room or growth day room or whatever it is.
So I think it might be both. It's growth day that they're there for, and it's a birthday room. So I'm not sure if it's a bit of inconsistency there in the wording.
Yeah, potentially. But again, what are the stakes there? They still must bang and clash around and scream, like maybe in the comfort of their own home, but there's not this sort of fully explored idea of what it means to be on a budget and why that makes it harder.
That comes out in the first paragraph, the idea of strapping your teenage child as a form of transportation, which is compelling, like why, but it's not really clear from any of the context why that would be required.
Why you would do that, because they're not going to grow until they get to this room. So they're not sort of posing a threat. So why can't they just be inside the Subaru?
Yeah.
The other part of it, so is the single parents part of the title. These women are single mothers, and that's mentioned, but again, not fully explored or explained what impact that has on them, apart from being a bit jealous of this other woman who has this birthday room at her house. So I think those were ideas that in the editing process, you maybe needed to decide, am I going to fully explore this and what's that going to mean for my story? Or is that something that's not this story? The story is the comedy of the growing, and it's not so much relevant whether they're single parents or just parents. That's a decision only you can make, really.
Yeah, I actually liked the way this opened. So the opening line is, on his 15th birthday, Henry's mother, Susan, parked their old rusty Subaru at the Government Growth Day Centre, then loosened the straps holding Henry down to the roof. That ticks a lot of boxes. We've talked about naming your characters early, and this certainly does name Henry and the mother, Susan.
Yep.
One thing I will say is that the perspective character here is Susan, but you've described Henry's mother, Susan.
Yeah. So I would just neaten that sentence up a little bit. You start with Susan. So Susan parked the old rusty Subaru at the Government Growth Day Centre, then loosened the straps holding her son, Henry, down to the roof. Brings Susan right to the front.
Susan needs to be the focus.
Then Henry, and then you can explain that it's Henry's birthday. I think starting with Henry sets up the expectation that this is going to be Henry's story, and it's not.
Yeah, but I did like the way that sentence was structured, because it set up the characters, it set up the key elements of the story, and it also got you asking questions like, what's the Government Growth Day Centre? Why is he strapped to the roof?
Yeah.
So these are good questions to grip a reader and lead them into your story.
Yeah, so definitely from that perspective, it's very effective, and all I think it needs is a little bit of a shuffle around.
Yeah.
There's a couple of little things in this story, much like the other stories, there always is, that you can find. And so here's a little opportunity, which was again just around filtering, which is something we mentioned in the last episode with the other daredevils that we talked about. An example here is Henry ran ahead to check in with the other kids as Susan spotted Katie walking up.
Yeah.
This is a good attempt at keeping things in Susan's perspective as the main character. So I like that Susan is the one spotting Katie walking up, but it does introduce that extra layer that separates the reader from the action.
Yeah.
So why not just describe Katie walking up? If we know we're in Susan's perspective, which will be assisted by starting with Susan rather than Henry, then you can just describe Henry running off and Katie walking up without needing to inject Susan back into that sentence.
I will also add a little bit before that, we have the little paragraph of Susan scanned the parking lot for her usual friends, Katie and Leslie, who would be here today as well. Both were single mums like Susan. One thing that I think should be avoided is describing characters doing things like looking.
Yeah. Looking, standing, sitting, noticing.
Instead of saying Susan scanned the parking lot for her usual friends, Kate and Leslie, who would be here today, if you wanted to attack it this way, you could say Katie and Leslie hadn't arrived yet.
Yeah, and that's simple enough. And then when they walk on stage, when Katie arrives or when Leslie arrives, that's when you bring that commentary around them also being single mums. And ideally, you would make that clear through the action. You would show that, not just say they were both single mums like Susan. You would show that they're both single mums.
Yeah.
If that is relevant, which I'm not 100% sure that it is in the way the story is told currently.
Yep. One
little bit that I liked, and I've already hinted at it, was, didn't you hear? Her new husband got them a birthday room. Seriously? What a bitch. There's a lot of subtext in that.
Yeah.
She's rich, right? Leslie is rich. But there's a little bit of, potentially a bit of inconsistency here.
Yeah.
So we've just described Katie and Leslie as being single mums like Susan, and now we're saying new husband.
Yeah, it's an inconsistency. As a reader, you can look at that and say, oh, well, she must have been a single mum who has recently gotten married to a rich husband, and that's the situation, that's the dynamic here.
That's clearly it.
But the fact of the inconsistency makes you stop and try and work things out in a way that could be avoided.
And again, we're just implying that the marriage puts her in a position of privilege, but again, it's not really clear why a birthday room is a huge advantage.
Yeah, it's a luxury, but we don't know the nature of the luxury. So there's a little bit of dialogue here, like an exchange here. Go ahead, honey, whispered Susan, tousling Henry's hair. Henry ran ahead to check in with the other kids as Susan spotted Katie walking up. Susan, exclaimed Katie. I think a lot of that doesn't really need to be described.
Yeah.
There are a few passages here of just little exchanges that you can just skip entirely.
Yeah, we don't want to just move from A to B in a logical progression. We want it to be a story progression. We want things to be happening that are intriguing and keeping us gripped. What I thought Jaden also did well here was subtext. So, for example, Emma wants boobs this year, but not much hope there. Katie patted her flat chest with both hands. So the implication is that Katie is flat-chested, her daughter's going to be flat-chested, and then later we get the comedy, I guess, that was not to be.
Yep.
I like that. And it's also, the good thing about that is that it's also setting up that comedy. It's also setting up the conclusion there. What I thought was maybe less well done, or something that I found a little bit awkward, at least for me when I read it, was, yeah, Mum hated these, Susan quipped, groping her breasts. Like, whoa.
Maybe groping is not the right word.
Yeah, I don't think it's the right word, and it's full on. That's saying a lot about this character of Susan, that she's just like, and I know people like that, so that's okay. But it seems to come out of nowhere, and it's quite a confronting visual image. Like if someone just did that to me, if I was just chatting to them and then they did that, I'd be like, whoa, okay, righto. So maybe that could have been handled a little bit more delicately, or if we're going for that image, set it up in a way that makes it feel more expected and more fitting with what else is going on. I don't know if this is a men writing women, a hashtag men writing women situation, perhaps what they might imagine women do.
It could be.
And then someone pulled out a pillow and there's a pillow fight. Having said that, in terms of the comedy, there are some other fun visuals. Like if he doesn't get his wish, he's going to be going to school in crop tops and capris. That's very visual. We can picture that, right? This poor 15-year-old is now, his shirt's up to his chest and his pants are up to his knees. That's great. And that certainly leans into that comedic tone. Another one that does that, and I guess this is where the link comes back for the reader, is God, just imagine dealing with all that teen angst and anger all the time. Better to just get it over with. So we're reflecting back on the reality, which is that we have to go through this slow process of growth and that it's quite difficult as parents to handle that. So that's where the payoff is for the reader in this one.
I'll say there's something that confused me a little bit about the paragraph just before it, where Katie says, I don't know what I'll do if they pass that gene therapy law allowing everyone to grow slowly over the year instead of all at once. How would you even budget for that? And so that is a reflection on how our world operates. I actually thought from the introduction, I got the feeling that this was set in the future and the world had become like this just because of that line in the first paragraph where Henry is strapped to the roof and Susan says she knew people didn't approve. Not even 50 years ago, she would have been lapidated, but strapping down was the currently accepted method for transportation of growing teenagers for people of Susan's status. So I got from that first paragraph,
something's happened to me.
And that reference to 50 years ago, things were different. The world of the story has moved into this kind of dystopian situation.
The government has gained control over teen growth. Yeah.
But we get the reference here of, you actually need a new gene therapy to
change it.
So we're not changing it back. We're actually in a universe where this is the default. And I'm not sure if Jaden has a view in his mind, but I think that's just something to watch, that you're painting a consistent vision of what the world is that you're building.
Yeah, and that's when it's tough for these kind of sci-fi stories and fantasy stories where you have to have the whole world, at least in your own mind, so that the logic is flawless within the story, because otherwise we get taken out of the story to try and figure that out. One other thing that I felt wasn't super clear in this story was this bet that was going on. The bet is because of the challenge of picking a winner. So they're gambling on the growth spurts, like who's going to get what they want. But it's not really clear up front that that's happening. It's revealed slowly and eventually that there's a bet put on, a $5 bet.
Yeah.
And it's just not clear why they're gambling on it, what the stakes of that bet are beyond just a bit of banter.
Well, the bet is not directly, it never is made within the story, right? The bet's not, it's alluded
already
to,
there.
And the conditions of the bet are not clear, like what constitutes a win. So when at the end it's announced that it looks like you're the winner or whatever the line is at the end, it's not clear why.
There's the comedic payoff of the daughter getting the boobs, right? And it feels nitpicky to say, oh, we don't understand the terms of the bet, but we honestly need to get that. Otherwise, it's just floating on the surface and not attached to anything.
Yeah.
And I think the issue there is that it probably was added because of the prompt and therefore wasn't a fundamental part of the story. It was more, it feels a little bit tacked on, to be honest. Like it doesn't have a real place in the heart of the story and what the story is trying to say, at least in the way the story is being told now.
Yeah, but I would say that the story does need some stakes, because another thing that we talk about is agency of the characters. You need a goal or a conflict or some sort of stakes that the characters are actively working to resolve.
Yeah.
And I think a bet is a good opportunity for at least some sort of stakes and some sort of an outcome that the reader is invested in. I don't know if it's the best way, but it is a way. And so that could have been something that's more elaborated on.
Yeah, like I think the implied stakes in this story is that it's expensive. Like the world's expensive. These particular characters, because of their social status as single parents, it is implied that they therefore don't have much money. Yeah. It's talked about hand-me-downs and about the implications of, oh God, imagine if you had to grow slowly and what that would mean as an additional cost burden. It is stressful spending money on that sort of stuff all the time. But the stakes aren't like life or death. And so we just need to understand, if it's going to be this gamble, maybe the bet is a higher bet. Maybe it's not a $5 bet. Maybe you're gambling like something that is much more meaningful. And therefore already the drama is enhanced by the fact that more is at stake in this gamble. So what I would say about the ending is that we've got Susan loses the bet, right? Because her son comes out with a midriff top on.
Yep.
And so she gives Katie $5. But then Katie's offering her a gift card.
Yeah.
Wait, what?
Yeah.
Didn't you win the bet? Why are you giving her a gift card? You feel sorry for her? I don't understand. And then tables turn when Emma walks out with her own midriff top because she's got boobs now and now her shirt's lifted. So now Katie's like, damn it. And then Susan says, let's call this one a draw. And she takes the $5 back and then says, but I'm still going to take you up on the gift card.
Yeah.
I mean, I just feel like that's not therefore the strongest ending for this story, because now I'm confused. What happened with this bet? Why is a gift card being mentioned? The bra thing, okay, that's paying off the comedy. That's fine.
Yeah.
The bet has just not been fully thought out, I don't think. Like, it is an opportunity for increasing stakes, but if you're not going to use it for that, then maybe there's other things that you could be doing with that extra word count. Like, obviously, outside of the comp where you're not needing to pick a winner, you could do anything with those words.
Let's talk about the prompts then. And the first one was the date prompt. And Jaden chose lapidated, which I think is a great word, and it's one that we both had to look up. But the risk of choosing, I guess, an obscure word is that your reader does have to look it up, and it may not be clear what is meant in the context.
Yeah, and I feel like a Katie or Susan in this story, like I'm kind of roughly that age, and so if I don't know what that word means, as an average person, I think, why would Susan know what that word means, and why would that be the first word that jumps into her head to describe the possible outcome? Like, I would never say that, like, oh, I might be lapidated for not putting my kid in a booster seat. It just wouldn't be how I describe things. So it can be jarring in that sense.
Yeah. It can just stick out as the prompt in that situation,
But I mean, having said that, thanks for giving me a new word.
And we've spoken about picking a winner that is the bet. And the anti-prompt approach is very similar to the other daredevils that we have talked about, which is avoiding dialogue tags where possible.
Now, this was by far and away the most common way that people handled the anti-prompt in this comp. But the one additional thing which does break the always use said rule is using creative verbs. And there are creative verbs in this particular story. So we've got exclaimed Katie, asked Susan, yelled Henry, murmured Susan, replied Susan. So there's plenty of different verbs in there too. So that by all means breaks the rule. And I think this is probably a case where those creative verbs don't really add a huge amount of value to the story, and is probably a good example of why you wouldn't necessarily use them normally, if not for the challenge of the anti-prompt. And I think in this case too, the times when the dialogue tags were dropped altogether, some of those times were confusing and needed a Susan said or whatever to just make it more clear, or an action beat ideally to make that more clear. But having said that, it was a fun story. I really did like the idea and the visuals of this kid getting driven down, strapped to the roof. Now, I have a Subaru and I could strap some kids up there, I reckon. So I have a very clear visual of that. And just the Government Growth Day Centre.
Yeah.
I love that too.
Yeah, there were a lot of great details in this story, and I think the concept was a creative one and an interesting one.
Yeah, so I hope we've got some suggestions in there that maybe you agree with, that maybe you think, okay, like I could try that and see how that might level up my story. But overall, great effort, and thanks for sharing.
Our second daredevil for this episode is the story Regurgitate. That's D-A-T-E, a little bit of a pun in the title, by Tom Brodkin. Mr. Prince, I'm Victoria, the nurse announced, breezing into the room. I'm here to fit your sling. Is this the first time you've broken your arm? Albert was at a loss for words. The Percocet had definitely kicked in, but that wasn't the reason for his speechlessness. Victoria was wearing faded blue scrubs with a fresh stain that was an unusual shade of yellow. Her hair looked as if it had been combed with a fork, and there were more than a few blonde strands that hadn't made it into her black scrunchie. Yet she was beautiful, even near the end of her shift. Mr. Prince, she repeated, opening the cabinet doors and grabbing 2 cartoon-covered slings. What? Yes? I mean, no. It's the first time I broke this one. This one? Yeah, I broke the other arm in college, playing football. Oh, you're one of those guys, Victoria observed, unprofessionally, trying to ignore his curly black hair and warm hazel eyes. Those guys? Yeah, the ones my mother warned me about. You're not catching me at my best, Albert joked, flashing a boyish grin. But if you introduce me to Mum, I'm sure she'd approve. You have 2 options, Victoria interrupted. Buzz Lightyear or Pocahontas. We mostly get younger patients here. You know, the kinds that aren't old enough to know better. Which one gets me your number? Excuse me? Your phone number, in case I need to call you, you know, to help with my sling. That's not happening, Victoria replied, suppressing a smile. You're afraid I'm a regurgitate? A regurgitate? Yes, someone you go out with who makes you throw up in your mouth a little. She laughed before catching herself. I can't. Why? Albert asked. Give me one good reason you can't give me your number and I'll drop the whole thing. Victoria put her hands on her hips. You're the 3rd guy to hit on me tonight, probably the 10th this week. Besides, I don't go out with patients. Well, there you have it. I'm not a patient. I'm impatient. Mr. Prince. Victoria held up 2 slings, high enough to conceal the smile that covered her face. Pick one. Oh, all right. I'll take a Buzz, Albert replied. And your number? I admire your persistence, Victoria conceded, sliding the sling over his cast and adjusting the strap, ensuring a proper fit. I'll be the first to sign it if you like. I guess that'll have to do. Where would you like it? Right here, he answered, pointing to his forearm. Closest to my heart. Victoria pulled a pen from her pocket and signed where he had indicated. There you go. Make sure you keep that dry. I will, Albert agreed, looking down at his mended arm. To his surprise, Victoria 555-850-3723 was written in red, a heart outlining the numbers. Have a nice day, Victoria grinned before disappearing into the hallway. You too, Albert whispered, grabbing his phone. After all, he was an impatient patient.
I just want to start by saying thank you, Tom, for the lols, because you wouldn't have heard it because Ed would have now edited it all together without our bullshit. But we were having a good laugh because this is a fun scene and just like picturing the banter between these two. We're just adding some extra innuendo that wasn't there. It was good fun. So thanks for that. So the main thing I liked about this story was the title.
Yep.
And the idea of the regurgitate, which I don't know if that's a thing, but I've never heard about it.
Either.
But now it prompts me to ask you, have you ever had a regurgitate?
A date so bad that it makes you throw up in your mouth a little.
If you're being dramatic. I mean, you're not going to literally throw up in your mouth.
No. Have you? I'm sure you have. Oh, yeah. Sure.
They're the best ones. They're the best stories later.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever fit their sling, if you know what I mean?
I did not, no. Anyway, we won't go into my history there.
So this is a story that clearly is leaning into the anti-prompt.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost entirely dialogue, except with some action beats and the opening paragraph, which has a little bit of a description. But it has enough description that you know everything about the setting that you need to. That doesn't really need anything more. You're in a hospital or you're in an emergency room. And the one thing that was a bit strange to me is that they didn't have just a plain sling. That seems like a bit of an oversight.
I have to say, I feel like it's a little bit harsh when she's like, anyway, most of the people we get in here are kids who are too young to know better.
Yeah.
Like, adults can break their arms, Tom.
Yeah. It is a bit rude, but it's just a bit of flirtation that's going on here.
Yeah, right. Like, so what you're suggesting is she does have a plain sling and she's
just trying to, I think it's called negging.
Are you sure?
No.
Okay. So, like, it's clearly a comedy, right?
Yeah.
Like, the dad jokes, the lame jokes, like the terrible pickup lines, they're great. They would win me over, by the way. Like, I'm a sucker for a lame line. Even the character name, Albert Prince.
Yeah.
Like, isn't it the Prince Albert in a can
actually,
joke? Like, so I thought that was interesting as well. So this does go to that post-single effect, right? Like, if everything's working towards that comedic tone, like, why do we have cartoon slings? Because it's funny. And why is his name Albert Prince? Because it's funny.
Isn't Queen Victoria's husband Prince Albert as well? Like Royal Albert Hall and so probably intentional.
Which would you choose, by the way, Buzz Lightyear or Pocahontas?
I think I'd go Buzz Lightyear.
Follow-up question. Have you ever heard the wolf cry to the full... Buzz Lightyear? Okay.
Don't ask me to justify it. Like,
he's cool.
He's an astronaut or whatever he is. He's a spaceman of some sort. He's got a flying suit.
Oh, man, we've lost the plot. Okay, one thing that I thought was potentially problematic, a bit of an interesting choice, is that we've got Victoria described breezing into the room, and then we immediately go into like how gross her scrubs are and how unkempt her hair is, and she's meant to be this sex symbol, and yet she's really doing it rough by the sounds of things at the start there.
She's very rough yet.
But
she's beautiful.
She's super hot. So there's, I guess, the contradiction that lends itself to comedy. But I'm not sure that it's a funny description. It's kind of a gross description, like a weird yellow stain.
It's what's interesting is it sounds like from the description that he was into that yellow stain specifically. Because, we talk about
Why is he noticing it and then being like, oh, hello, Victoria?
Yeah, well, talking about the close third person, you interpret that as what he's saying. So he was at a loss for words, and she was wearing faded blue scrubs with a fresh stain that was an unusual shade of yellow. It's described in very provocative terms.
Yeah, and then she goes to speak to him and he's like, he can't get a word out because he's just so captivated. I don't know. I'm not sure I'm sold on that. I think there are ways to do a similar thing and make it lean more into the comedy of it rather than the sort of creepy vibe.
Yeah. And that is a problem. The interaction was quite creepy.
Yeah, like he's sort of pushing the issue and it's inappropriate, right? She's at work. Like maybe that's a bit woke to say, I don't know, but like she's in a professional setting. It's not appropriate for a patient and a nurse to like start actively hitting on each other to the point of dishing out numbers and stuff.
But especially because she has already said no.
Yeah. So I do think that would have benefited from being more her on board from the start.
And I want to be clear, like it's fine if your story has a character who is creepy.
Oh, totally.
But I don't think that's the vibe that...
No, the vibe's meant to be fun and light. And yeah, for most women, it's not fun and light to be hit on at work by some dude. Okay, so if we're going to see how this character is appealing with his curly black hair and warm hazel eyes. Hazel is the best colour of eyes, by the way. That's a bit of a point of view shift there. So we've gone now from Mr. Prince or Albert's perspective on Victoria and how she's hot to now we're getting Victoria's perspective on why he might be hot. And that's a little bit of a problem because we don't dwell at all in her perspective.
Yeah.
So it's really unnecessary to do that there. Like there might be another way of showing her reacting to his looks, like showing her being attracted to him in a way that doesn't call it out specifically from her perspective. So the line, "You're not catching me at my best," Albert joked, flashing a boyish grin. Like, you can't see your own grin to call it boyish. Like, that's her perspective again.
That's right. The boyish description as well is not something you would never say that you had a boyish grin yourself.
If you did, it would sort of contribute to that creepy perspective of you. So with the dialogue, we've got some of this fun, silly jokes and so on. But towards the end, I don't know, it drops off a little bit. We've got, "Have a nice day, you too." I feel like we can do better than that. I feel like we can have something more poignant there. This is the end. It's the climax of the story. Like,
he's had these great comebacks this whole way through. He's come up with this phrase, regurgitate, and he's got these like quick little quips.
Yeah.
And then she's like, "Have a nice day." And he's like, "You too."
And the final line, "After all, he was an impatient patient," that's the quip, but he doesn't get to make it. That's like the thing he wishes he said after she walks away.
I think that could have been a little bit more fun banter at the end.
Yeah, like if you're going to go lame, like go even harder, go bam, like the lamest there. Go really win her over there. So to be fair, right, we've talked about how he's a bit cringe and a little bit creepy. Like, he did say he was a regurgitate. Potentially.
That's true. Yeah.
So the story does fit the title. It does work. I'm not sure that Victoria's throwing up in her mouth a little. I think she seems
she seems into it.
By the end, she's cool. Yeah. Where do you think they go on their date?
I mean, probably the hospital cafe, because he's asking her out right there. "Maybe, when do you get off?
And how?
And how?
And can I help you?
And how did you get that yellow stain?" They're on the date and he's just constantly talking about the yellow stain. Like, what is it?
And can I have some?
What does it smell like?
Shit. Oh, man. Sorry, Tom. Very disrespectful of your art.
Okay, so let's talk about the prompts.
So we've talked about regurgitate already. I love that one. That was one of the more creative takes, for sure. We called that one out in the long list episode.
Yep. And picking a winner was obviously the romance that's now blossoming. And as I think you said in the last episode, this was probably our most common interpretation of this prompt.
And what I think Tom did really well here, and this is something that we've said for others that might want to look at it, it's very clear who's speaking every time. And, you know, the lame jokes, that's building a character. So we're getting a sense of someone who, and their language and their way of speaking. And then Victoria's way of speaking, kind of this giggling hesitation at what he's saying and this attempt to remain professional despite her physical actions maybe revealing a little bit more than she'd like to about the fact that she's going along with this. So I thought that was great. I didn't think in some of the other cases I felt like I sort of lost track of who was speaking a little bit. This one, we knew who was speaking. That was clear. And I thought that was a strength of this piece.
Yeah, this approach of focusing on dialogue, especially when it's just two people, which makes it easy to follow. I think that's quite a good approach for this anti-prompt, and you don't get bogged down into who's where and all the details there. They're just having a conversation. It's in a room, they're having a conversation. A couple of things happen, like she holds up the two slings, for example, but they're not going anywhere. Nothing's happening that you really need to describe. So that's a pretty good way to structure a story. I think when you do choose to structure a story like that built around the conversation, you do need to make sure that conversation is on point.
Yeah, you need to make sure the plot is still developing through the conversation, like not just rehashing the same stuff, but that it's escalating, things are happening, we're moving from place to place, which I think this one did. I think it could have maybe had a bit more like conflict and a little bit more drama to it, because ultimately it's just a bit of banter between two people. Like, what are the stakes here? What's the conflict? But nevertheless, you did watch it progress. Like the plot followed. He did gradually win her over, and it rounded out to a conclusion, all within that dialogue.
Look, it's difficult to provide this feedback and say, well, there could have been more drama and there could have been more conflict. It's clearly a light comedic piece, and that's the tone that we're going for. But you can always have a more satisfying conclusion for a reader if you do add those additional elements into it.
Yeah, for sure. I think probably if I had to say one thing to level this story up, it would be more drama, which usually means more conflict. And in this case, we've already established that it's a bit difficult with the conflict because we don't want him to have to like fight too hard to get her number because that has a different vibe to it. But what we do want is some sort of sense, again, of the stakes. Like what happens if he doesn't get a number? Like, can we maybe make her his perfect woman somehow so that he feels he must get her number and he's going to be like pushed out of this emergency room really quickly and so he's only got this one last chance. Like these are ways to introduce a little bit of drama that don't necessarily involve conflict between the two characters, but which introduce a level of challenge to the character to get what he wants by the end of the story.
And there are also things that you can use like awkwardness or misunderstanding in the conversation. Albert is very, like he's suave and he's self-confident and all those kinds of things. He's self-confident at least. He's got these lines. He's putting himself forward pretty well. Like basically she's into him or not, you know? There could be a situation where if you wanted to ramp up the drama or the tension, maybe he's a bit awkward. Maybe he says something that doesn't quite mean in the way that it's
he puts his foot in it. So like maybe he's starting to win her over, then he puts his foot in it and she's like, whoa, and then he has to win her back again. Yeah, for sure. But it was lots of fun.
It was lots of fun. We had a lot of fun reading the story and we can tell that you had a lot of fun writing it as well.
Yeah, I did like this one. I do appreciate lame jokes, so thank you, Tom.
All right, so we're almost at the pointy end of the stick.
Okay. If you say so.
Let me say that again.
No, I like it. It's funny. Mildly threatening. Raising the stakes. Introducing conflict and drama.
That's right.
So we're nearly ready to get to our final daredevil who made it to the shortlist, who must know by now that she made it to the shortlist. But before we get there, let's just share our wildcards.
Our 2 wildcards. So these are our wildcard entries. They're not in the shortlist. They may not even be in the long list. But these are 2 entries that we thought were special in some way, that had a certain something that we wanted to call out. And they both win $50. So our first story...
Congratulations to...
Linda Atkins for her story Pick Me. So I think the reason we chose this story as a wildcard is the turn it took in the second half and the unexpected direction it went in. So it starts off with our character Daisy, whose father has passed away, and she's dealing with the grief by working inside his greenhouse, essentially. And her father died in the greenhouse. And there's a whole thing about grief and connecting to the place where he died and what he was doing there, which is growing these flowers. And she's trying to win a flower competition.
Beat the neighbor Bill.
But in the second half of the story, it becomes this highly sexual thing where she's having sex in the greenhouse and talking about how it's helping the flowers grow. And in the end, she transforms literally into a plant, into a flower. And I didn't see any of that coming.
No. So I guess what we wanted to reward there was just the bravery and the creativity and the idea of having an idea and just going full pelt with it.
Yeah, it was very imaginative and it was not a cliche story. It was not retreading the same things that we've read 1,000 times. It was something that was completely different. And that whole mix of the exploration of grief with this weirdly sexual situation and then this magical realism angle, it did work in a way. And it all linked in together and it was very expressive.
And very memorable. So congratulations, Linda.
And our other wildcard winner is...
also on the topic of grief.
Leo Reese Orin with the story Grief.
So similarly to the last one, I guess for this one, we wanted to reward the creative take. But the thing that made this story most memorable, I think, was the protagonist.
This story takes place at a funeral.
Well, at a burial, really, isn't it?
Yeah. And what's interesting about this is that the protagonist who's at the burial is the murderer of the deceased, basically. And it has this weird insight into the mind of, I guess, like a psychopath. We don't know exactly what's happened, but he's killed her and he's very possessive of her. And it looks like that he's killed her because he wants to have her pure and his for all eternity. And it was an interesting perspective and not one that I'd seen expressed in this way in flash fiction. It's very dark and it's quite confronting.
Yeah, there was one line that I think got me, and I'll just share that with you. So the protagonist here, the villain, is confronted by the boyfriend of the deceased, who's like, did she say anything about me? Like, what were her final moments? Like, the boyfriend is suspicious of this guy, and he's asking, what did she say? And the response is, I can't resist flaunting my victory. I spit on his suit. She said, more baby.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, that one just got me. I could just picture that being said, and just like how gut-wrenching to hear that from the person who you assume in this case is the killer. But yeah, congratulations, Leo. Love the character. I'm a big fan of the Joker movie with Joaquin Phoenix, and this had that sort of energy to me, just that insight into the villain. So congratulations.
Okay, so now we're into the shortlist proper with our 6th place holder, which happens to be our Daredevil as well. And so this story is Survival Guide to Staying Single by M. Lee Gray. And M. Lee Gray was one of our Daredevils last time.
Yeah, back for more.
And obviously helped by our feedback because she's now in the shortlist.
Oh, yeah, that's totally on us.
That's on us.
I'll take that.
Yeah.
All right, this is Survival Guide to Staying Single by M. Lee Gray. Radiant, you agree. The bride glows under the spotlights in the center of the dance floor, but you don't let yourself daydream about being her. You know, not everyone gets lucky. You know every girl lined up next to you thinks she deserves the next groom. Only one of you will survive catching the bouquet. Blood runs down the bride's elbows and colours her creamy gown. Men block your way off the dance floor. Ready, set, a DJ mumbles into a microphone. One girl doesn't wait and she jams her finger into another girl's eye. Wedding guests stomp and you're sure the whole building will crash down and bury everyone alive. The bride fakes the first few throws, but those of you with a plan hang back. You can't feel bad for the girls who fall first, not here, not now. As soon as they hit the floor, men grab onto their ankles and wrists, grab clumps of hair and drag them into their new lives where their behaviour is corrected before they're dressed up for their first date and displayed like trophies. It's you versus the bouquet, and when the bride pulls the ribbon loose, the groom's heart falls out of the centre and rolls across the floor. No one moves to grab it because you all know you'll collide, hit the ground in pairs, get pulled apart and tossed from man to man until there's nothing left of you but jagged bone. You've seen women, know women who think they've prayed hard enough for a groom of their own. None of them survive the dance floor. All of them are dragged away. It's to convince themselves, because it doesn't convince you when you hear those women repeat, "He's a good man." The bouquet goes high into the air and splits into wads of flesh, whole kidneys and severed toes, pieces you don't recognise that the bride tore out of the groom with her bare hands. Teeth rain and scatter, so girls slip and they're lost to the pack of men at the edge of the dance floor. Every move you make is life and death. When you see the groom's severed hand, you know you won't get another chance, so you dive for it. 10 women lost to 1 man kept is a ratio you refuse to accept. Behind your back, everyone whispers, "She's difficult." The groom's bloody palm almost slips out of your grip, but you lace your fingers through it. You knew from the start, it's almost impossible to survive catching the bouquet. Even those men who'll take any woman still want to break her themselves. So as girls pile on top of you, claw at you for the groom's hand, you don't fight back. You don't even scream while they snap your arms and legs. At least this way, you can put your pieces back together however you want, instead of being forced into a shape you were never meant to be.
So this is similar to the wildcards we've just talked about. This is one where we really wanted to reward just going for it. This is a story that is a metaphor, maybe. It's gruesome, it's strange, where did it come from? Emily Gray's
I'm starting to worry about you, Emily Gray.
Emily Gray's last story was about two dead girls.
Living dead girls.
And reincarnation and all sorts of things being thrown in there.
So I love your brain.
She's definitely full of ideas that are just bursting out onto the page.
I'm so jealous because that's probably the one thing I always say is my main weakness is the ideas. I really love that you've leaned into this weird take. And what I love most, I think, is that juxtaposition between the bouquet toss, which is just meant to be this fun thing. But we know when some of the women are drunk, it can get a bit wild sometimes. And so taking that to the extreme, but then layering in this extra meaning.
Another thing I like about this story is it's a perfect amount of scope for flash fiction. Like we're talking about a bouquet toss.
Yeah.
And we're not changing scenes. We're not going from one place to another. We're not introducing a cast of characters. It's describing one thing happening and building.
And also, like, as an extension of that, you don't have to explain a lot.
Yeah.
So like in Tom's story where we know we're in a hospital and we've all got a picture of what a hospital looks like and we don't actually need to fill in those blanks for the reader. Same goes here. All of us, I guess, have been to weddings, seen a bouquet toss, or at least have a concept of a bouquet toss at a wedding. And so you don't actually need to fill in those blanks because the reader's brain is already doing that.
But it does subvert your expectations because you get this description. It's not what you expect. Things start to go weird. Like there's body parts flying all over the place and she's trying to grab onto a hand, a severed hand.
Slippery.
Yeah.
Ew.
So I think one of the things that we were struggling with here is trying to unpack this metaphor and get to the core of exactly what it means.
Yeah.
I think we had similar feedback for Emily's last story, which was, well, we weren't quite sure what all the relationships were between the characters and what the backstory was. It's a little bit different here, but there's a similar vibe that we kind of get what's going on, but we would like to understand a little bit more. The clue is in the title, which is Survival Guide to Staying Single. So we've got a character that wants to stay single and is kind of getting thrown into these relationships and she's seeing what's happening to other people in relationships and she doesn't want that for herself. She's trying to avoid it. She's trying to get out of it, but still she's just getting hit by the shrapnel and debris from these other relationships. And I love that image.
Honestly, I've been puzzling over this story since I first read it and struggling with it. And you've just unlocked something for me there right in that moment, which was drawing it back to the title. So the Survival Guide to Staying Single. Yeah. Now, if I think of this from the perspective of staying single, it starts to make a bit more sense. Like these women getting dragged off the dance floor. I'm picturing the scene from Mean Girls where suddenly they all turn into African animals and it's like this battle scene where lions are dragging each other out and acting like apes and all this sort of stuff. That's what I'm picturing, like this wild scene where women are getting dragged by the ankles off the dance floor into relationships that they don't want. And I think that visual is strong, but I think what wasn't strong for me was understanding, well, why are the pieces of this groom being thrown around? The story behind the bouquet toss is that the bride tosses the bouquet and whichever single woman catches it is going to be the one to get married next.
Yeah.
So in this scene, we're tossing a bouquet of the groom's body parts, but it's just sort of splitting.
Yeah.
And we're scrambling for pieces of the groom. Well, why are we scrambling? If we want to stay single, why are we scrambling for pieces of the groom?
Yeah, I think that's what needs a little bit of honing there, fine-tuning, because at the beginning every girl lined up next to you thinks she deserves the next groom. Only one of you will survive catching the bouquet. And it's not clear what catching the bouquet results in. Does that result in you finding the next groom in the same ways it does in the real world? Because the protagonist appears to be trying to catch
a piece,
but she also appears to not want to find a groom because all of them are dragged away. It's to convince themselves because it doesn't convince you when you hear these women repeat, he's a good man. So she's saying that she's not interested in men or she knows that they're all rationalizing the fact that he's a good man, yet she is making this attempt at catching the bouquet and it's not clear whether she's fighting against her own impulse, like I don't want to, but I do want to. So there might be that conflict and she's not sure if she wants to stay single. So I think that character element also needs to just be clear and towards that single view of what does the character want.
And I think it comes in the final line too, where it says, Even those men who will take any woman still want to break her themselves. So as girls pile on top of you, claw at you for the groom's hand, you don't fight back. You don't even scream while they snap your arms and legs. This is the extreme version of the bouquet toss, which I love. At least this way you can put your pieces back together however you want instead of being forced into a shape you were never meant to be. So that's the message, I think, that being in a relationship forces you into a shape you were never meant to be. And you'd rather have your bones snapped by women jumping on you, clawing for this hand. Like you'd rather go for that because the chance of being single and getting to be yourself is more important than or more valuable to you than being forced into some shape you don't fit. But the challenge there is like, why are some girls already being dragged away? We haven't resolved who won the toss yet. Like girls are being dragged off left, right and centre, but we're still fighting over the pieces. That presumably there's still a chance to win the groom's hand, for example. But I guess having said all that, like it was clear that it was going for a message about men and women and relationships and like that part was clear. I think it just needed to go that little extra step to connect the dots for us. And that was the thing we said last time as well for Emily Gray's story. Maybe that's something you need to work on, a little bit of clarity, because what you don't need to work on is cool ideas.
Yeah, that's right. One interpretation that I had of this whole bouquet toss thing is that if you've been in the dating world for a long time, you might at some point think who you're dating are like the leftover broken bits of past relationships. You're just getting these bits of people that haven't worked out for other people in the past. I wonder if that's part of the metaphor.
That's what I think's great about this idea. There's so much to it. There's so much to think about and it has left me thinking. And I think that's a real strength. Like it's got a lot of potential in that regard. By all means, I want to still be thinking at the end and have a couple of questions. But I think we said this last time. I don't want the question to be what's going on.
Yeah.
I want the question to be, what does that mean for me?
Yeah, you got to ponder the implications.
How do I reflect now on either my own relationships or on like the state of the dating game in the world or whatever it is that you might be reflecting on? I want to ponder that, not hang on a second, why did she go for his hand? So I think those things need to be clarified. And we talked about how challenging it was to determine our shortlist. We chose this story for the shortlist. There were like 4 other stories that were battling for this final spot. And the reason that we chose this one was because of that vivid imagery, because of that unique creative concept, because of the questions that it raised and how it made us feel. I have to say, like, I wish some of those questions had been wrapped up a little because I think it would have potentially even won.
Yeah, we could have got there.
Truly, if we just had that concept wrapped up. Whereas Emily Gray's story in the last competition, the Star-Crossed Lovers of Living Dead Girls, where I felt like that had maybe too much going on for a piece of flash and like extra characters and things that needed to be expanded upon. I don't think that necessarily this story needs to be expanded upon. I think it still could fit within the 500 words. And I think all it needs is a little bit of a reflection on exactly what you're trying to say and then a pointing of everything towards that message so that by the end we get a really clear picture of what you are trying to say about either the dating game or the state of relationships or men and women.
Yeah, there can be some ambiguity about the metaphor and the implications, but there shouldn't be any ambiguity about your central character and who they are and what they're trying to get out of the situation. And I think that's all that's needed to throw it into focus. And it's really just a few key edits, I think.
Yeah. If you say, for example, you know every girl lined up next to you thinks she deserves the next groom. Only one of you will survive catching the bouquet. That's the bit. When you say thinks she deserves the next groom, that implies that she wants a partner.
Yeah.
But you're saying a part, not a partner. She wants a part of this groom, but not the next groom. So that sentence needs to be, what is the next groom? Is that a relationship with someone? Is that a piece of a person? In which case, what does that represent? So the next line, only one of you will survive catching the bouquet. We've said for some of the other stories, they need stakes, right?
Yep.
Here are the stakes. You will die. if you do not win this bouquet toss, which is a great gripping way to start this story, by the way.
Yeah.
But also I need to understand why you're dying if you don't catch it. Like it's just that. If we just understand why they're here, what they're fighting for, what the stakes are if they fail, then the rest of it starts to make sense. And the character's motivation to catch a piece of this groom starts to make sense. In which case we can then bring our own interpretation about what that means about relationships between men and women. So let's talk about the prompts. I've almost forgotten about them, to be honest.
Yeah. Date is pretty straightforward, a romantic date, and very clear winner being picked here in the gruesome bouquet toss. And the anti-prompt, a few creative verbs thrown in. So you agree, DJ mumbles.
Behind your back, everyone whispers.
Yes.
She's difficult. Yeah, so a few just simple ones there. Yep. And they don't stand out in an offensive way. So this is an example of where I said back in the long list episode that I sort of felt like creative verbs were fine. And in most cases in flash fiction, I found them to be inoffensive. So I do think it's okay. And certainly ones like whispers and mumbles, they do impart a little bit of extra information that makes them feel deserving of going there instead of said at times.
I also don't think she's treated them as traditional dialogue tags here. So the first sentence is radiant, in quotes, you agree. So it's said somewhere, but it's not part of the dialogue tag. For example, ready, set, a DJ mumbles into a microphone. It's not ready, set, the DJ mumbles, for example.
Yeah, it's almost described in action as opposed to like transcribed as dialogue.
Yeah, it is quite a subtle little take on the anti-prompt, I think.
Yeah, I think done well.
I think one thing that we haven't spoken about, which is really interesting in this story, is that, well, it's a survival guide and it's one of the 2% of stories that is written in the second person. So the protagonist there is implied, but it's all you. Right, you do this, you do that. So I do wonder if the intention for Emily there is to leave it ambiguous as to what do you choose.
But it's a survival guide, so it's implied that you must want that because otherwise you will die. But anyway, ultimately, I think we've made our point clear. We just wanted a little bit more information about what's going on here. But apart from that, I bloody loved it. What I've noticed here is that we're getting really into it. And we're not talking about little finicky issues about the writing. And I don't think there are many, to be honest.
Yeah, and just like Emily's last one, this is a lot of fun to talk about.
Yeah, so well done. And thank you once again for sharing your talents with us. And congratulations on making the shortlist. Well done.
And now in 5th place, Adventure Awaits by Tara Babcock. The human line snaked around the outside of the town hall, and Ellie Mae was smack dab in the middle of it with her mama. Normally, Mama's strictness was speckled with smiles, but these past 2 days, she'd been all rigid like a dead stick. Mitzi got picked last year. Mama had thin lips that almost disappeared when she made that noise. I never get picked for nothing. Ellie Mae had won the talent show last spring, but that didn't count. She got that with work, and work wasn't lucky like the box. Let's hope it stays that way. But Mitzi, I don't want to hear another word about Mitzi. The talk always went like this with Mama, even when she'd cried her eyes out because Mitzi never came back to tell Ellie Mae about her adventures. She only knew the stories because her big brother Milton told her so at night while Mama was sleeping. The lacquer box was so shiny it looked wet, with poppies and daisies brightly painted around the lip of the lid. The slot in the top was so thin she couldn't see inside. Paper slips and fountain pens sat in front of it. Mr. Harper stood over the box and frowned when he saw her. His face had just about 1,000 wrinkles, but she wasn't going to count them all. 12 already, girl? Yes, sir. She spread out her pale green skirt so he could see the careful embroidery around the hem. One slip. He looked up at her mama. 2 for you. Mama nodded curtly and wrote her name in careful cursive twice. Ellie Mae's writing wasn't as pretty, but she'd worked hard at her letters so her penmanship was the nicest in her whole class. It wasn't fair that all the grown-ups got 2 papers and she only got 1. They didn't even like adventures. Ellie Mae went to put her slip in the box, but her mama held up her hand. You really couldn't stop the children from entering? Not even after last year? Town mandate, I'm afraid. 12 and older. You're the magistrate. You write the mandates. And the people approve them. While they argued, Ellie Mae scribbled her name 2 more times and stacked them carefully under the first slip. There, now she'd have 3. Anyone who liked adventure deserved to have 3. Fine. Mama's last word was sharp, but her hand shook. Ellie Mae slipped her papers in the box, careful to keep them in a neat little stack. Sneaking them in wasn't too hard, since Mama looked away as if the beautiful box were a spider or a June bug. They waited in the green in front of the town hall until everyone had their turn. Mr. Harper came out with the box and lifted the lid. His thick old hand swirled the papers around before he pulled out a slip. Ellie Mae. A hush like midnight swept over the crowd. Ellie Mae clapped, her smile as wide as her mama's eyes.
So thank you, Tara, and congratulations.
I thought this was a very well-written story, and there's a lot of information that's being expressed in subtle ways. There's a lot of subtext here. Mm-hmm. We don't really know the context of names coming out of this box, but we can imagine some sort of Hunger Games type scenario where whoever is being selected is...
It's not good.
It's not a good outcome.
They're not coming back.
And the parents don't want to tell the children why, because it's probably horrific. So poor little Ellie Mae thinks it's a good thing, and she puts her name down multiple times. And all of those elements are conveyed very subtly in the story. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what really stood out for me.
Yeah, and when we say show, don't tell, right, this is all showing.
Yeah, completely.
And what stood out to me was the tragedy of it.
Yeah.
Like, it's clearly a tragedy. We know she's getting picked for something horrific. But there were some lines that really built that. So I just want to shout a few of those lines out. So, but she'd worked hard at her letters, so her penmanship was the nicest in her whole class. Like, oh.
Yeah.
You know, she's working really hard because she's trying really hard. And if only she knew. And it just builds that sense of tragedy. It wasn't fair that all the grown-ups got 2 papers and she only got 1. They didn't even like adventures. Yeah. Like, how sweet. And just that childlike view of the world, and to have the adult's perspective, like the truth, like, oh, it speaks to just so many things about real life, the tragedy of getting older and learning the truth. So a couple more lines that really built up on that. While they argued, Ellie Mae scribbled her name 2 more times and stacked them carefully under the first slip. There, now she'd have 3. Anyone who liked adventures deserved to have 3. So just building that childlike view, and we know by this point it's not good, right? Yeah. The reader knows, but she doesn't know.
And the way that we know is not because we're told.
Exactly.
There's details like sneaking them in wasn't too hard since Mama looked away as if the beautiful box were a spider or a June bug.
Why is Mama looking away? Yeah. And she notices that Mama's looking away, but she doesn't put 2 and 2 together because she's not quite there yet. Yeah. She's about to find out.
And that's also quite amazing because the perspective character is a child. And how do you portray that child's innocence and lack of understanding while still getting the reader to understand what's happening?
And I think that is elegant because she's comparing it to the way her mama looks at a spider. So she's like, that's the same way I've seen her look at a spider, but I haven't connected why she's looking at this thing like that. And obviously the line, Ellie Mae slipped her papers in the box, careful to keep them in a neat little stack. Like she's trying to hide it from her mum because she's trying to sneak an extra little treat. Oh, God, I'm actually getting emotional. Am I hormonal? I want to cry. My kids are always trying to get little extra treats, so this just makes me feel sad. But another way that I think Tara has built on that childlike perspective, there's just a couple of lines like, for example, his face had just about 1,000 wrinkles, but she wasn't going to count them all. Like, that's a child's perspective, right? And one more thing I just want to call out is the line, the lacquer box was so shiny it looked wet. Like I can picture that, the black lacquer. So something so simple, but it's drawing attention to that one thing, which is going to be the crux of the whole plot, right?
Yeah.
This box. So doing that very quickly in a way that's kind of like creepy, right? It looks wet, like it looks.
And it's also a childlike observation. Yeah, well done, Tara. Excellent story.
Yeah, thanks for making me cry. So now, in fourth place, Hot Girl Summer by Laura J. Rain. Sherry pulled over into the first parking lot she saw, tyres crunching the broken pavement. Grabbing the crumpled brown paper, she pulled the dripping burger out of the bag before she had come to a full stop. The urge had itched at her for hours, even as she completed her food journal. Ounces and calories, meticulously recorded in perfect rows, red pen for fats, blue pen for carbs, green pen for fruits and vegetables. There was never enough green pen. "It's not your fault, Sherry," they would mule from their plastic-backed chairs, the condescending edge of their own victories cutting through the false staccato of their supportive words. The grease from the burger dripped down her chin as she stared, eyes glazed and unfeeling, out of the windshield at the dilapidated red bricks of the building. "Just look at your food journal, hun," the bottle blonde would drawl as she pushed her fake tits so close that a person could do nothing but notice. They ended a conversation before she did, thrust into your field of vision by her exaggerated posture and pinched shoulder blades. 7 weeks into the fitness challenge and Sherry had yet to lose an ounce. They would pick a winner in just 3 weeks, and the thought gnawed at her. Falsifying the journal had become a compulsion that haunted her every moment. Her refusal to admit her shame to the self-righteous fakes was at odds with any genuine desire to change. Shoving the last of the fries through salt-crusted lips, Sherry scrawled, "Afternoon snack, 2 ounces of almonds and fresh fruit," onto the open page on the dashboard and closed the worn, leather-bound notebook. Its gold-lettered enthusiasm glared back at her from the cover. No food tastes as good as skinny feels. Tearing her eyes away from the mantra, she crumpled the papered remnants of her afternoon snack and put the car in reverse, already calculating whether she would have enough time to throw up before her family got home.
What I loved about this story was how vivid and relatable it was. You know, just how she brought to life these struggles of conflicting motives and just sitting there in her car, I guess, reveling in her own inability to control herself. Like,
she's back on her bullshit, you might say.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's not a story in which a lot of stuff happens. Like, she's just sitting in her car, right? But the way that this struggle is brought to life in this scene where we're going into like her fitness challenge and we're going into her diary and seeing these bits and pieces and how they relate. And she knows what's at stake. You know, no food tastes as good as skinny feels. She's got her challenge hanging over her, and yet she still thinks that she's going to get away with it. She hasn't lost any weight, and her plan is, well, I might have to throw up when I get home. It's pretty messed up when you think about it, this whole situation. And I thought it was really well written and well constructed, and the character of Sherry was really put together well in the short space.
So we talked about how hard we found it to create a shortlist, but this was one of the easier ones purely because it was so cohesive. There was a strong sense of character. There was a story here. And I think maybe what brought it further down the list was the fact that it was just this sort of subtle moment, and the stakes weren't super high. But the writing is sound. The development of the character is sound. And there were some really great lines too, like the idea of this bottle blonde and her tits entering the conversation before she does. Like, that's really visual. And not only that, but there's subtext there, right? Like, what else is going on? She's fake. What does that mean? But isn't Sherry fake too? And so Sherry is almost like projecting on this other character. Right. Like, you're presenting this fake view of yourself. Well, hello, so is Sherry. And so that adds a layer of understanding here too. That's quite interesting. But in terms of sitting in a car park eating a burger we shouldn't be eating, like who has not done that? This is what my dear friend Pat calls a sneaky cheese. Not so sneaky now, is it?
No. And I mean, there's a lot of great instances here of showing, not telling.
Yeah,
so
100%.
Shoving the last of the fries through salt-crusted lips, Sherry scrawled, afternoon snack, 2 ounces of almonds and fresh fruit onto the open page. There might be a temptation for a writer to say, and she lied about what she was eating. There's no moral judgment being thrown in the narration. You're just being shown what she did. Like she ate chips and she wrote almonds.
While she was eating that.
So...
Yeah, and I love that contradiction because that's what's intriguing to a reader too. Like this is pretty simple here. She's eating chips, she's writing almonds. That's simple. But this is a higher order skill that you don't actually see a lot of in writing. And this is something like everybody listening, pay attention. This is really cool because for a reader, you're getting that little challenge of, hang on, I'm being presented with one thing, but it's in conflict with what I know to be the truth. And that is a very satisfying reading experience.
Yeah.
The other thing I just wanted to call out was my initial reaction to this story. So again, when I first read the stories, I put a comment against each one to sort of say the things that stood out to me, either good or bad. And one of the things that stood out to me for this story was, in fact, that the line, "There was never enough green pen," gave me literal goosebumps. And I don't know why, but just on the very first reading, that just hit me. Now, I'm not someone who has experienced disordered eating or a serious issue with any of that sort of stuff, so I don't want to get into that because that's not my space. But just this idea there's never enough green pen to sort of, and in this case, fake it, right? Like you're just trying so hard, desperately to make it work, and it's just not working. And that line, the subtext of that, you didn't say, oh, I was just desperately faking it and trying and writing always vegetables.
Yeah.
You just said there was never enough green pen. And all of that was conveyed in that simple sentence. So again, a higher order skill and a talent there to convey so much in just a few words.
And one thing that I want to call out as well is this is a very short story and I didn't even notice until I looked at the word count right now that it's 330 words basically.
Yeah.
So very short. And we would always say like, you know, use the words that you have. But I think the story is complete. I didn't step away from this thinking, oh, that was short and there wasn't much to it.
No, it packed a punch. It told a lot in that time. And I think that's why. Because if you can say, there was never enough green pen.
Yeah.
And tell me a whole shitload of stuff just with that one sentence, and you don't need 500 words.
Yep.
So I think we saw a lot of higher order skills, and that's why it was a clear shortlister for us.
Yeah. So well done, Laura. Coming in third place in the shortlist, but first for longest title, is A Guide to Judging the Pie Entries at the Women's Auxiliary Club Annual Fair from last year's judge, Who Should Have Known Better, by Sally Simon. Look like you're taking notes. Lots of notes. Preferably in a small notebook that closes when you lay it down to pick up your fork, so that no one sees what you're really writing is a list of places you'd rather be. Because let's face it, you already know which pie will come out on top and on whose chest you'll be pinning that oversized blue ribbon. Unless someone has hit an entirely unpleasant menopause or her husband has been cheating on her, these will likely be the top 4 pies. Mrs. Henderson's Blueberry Crumble. Nothing screams winner more than a brown sugar crumble over homegrown berries. Other women have tried, but this past champion has perfected the balance between sugar coating and fruity goodness. If her tartness level is spot on, her pie will make you pucker. Mrs. Murphy's Classic Apple. Some people think apple pie is boring. I say just because something's old and familiar doesn't mean it can't satisfy your taste buds. Trust me, you'll be pleasantly pleased. Mrs. Humble's Gooseberry Pie. Don't make the joke. Not to her or anyone within earshot. It's not funny anymore. Seriously though, have you ever tasted a gooseberry pie? Sometimes you don't know what you're missing until you know. Then there's no going back. Ms. Prine's strawberry rhubarb, the reigning champion. Opposites attract. The long, tart vegetable meets its match, coupled with the soft, sweet fruit we know and love. It's a risky combination. I used to be a fan, but everyone knows that already, don't they? After your last bite, savour the moment. Sigh. Then lumber to the judges' table where you'll find a pitcher of water. Pour a glass and take a long swig. Try not to be overly dramatic. Hunch over your notebook while condensation builds on the glass. Penelope Henderson, the past, present and future president of the auxiliary, will, at this point, nudge you and demand an update. How much longer could you possibly need? She'll quip loudly before flirtatiously adding, in a hushed tone, your tongue must be so overly excited with all that citrus. She'll wink. Make an effort to blow her off. Enough for people to notice. He can't be bought. That's what people will mutter and mumble amongst themselves. Act like you're adding up numbers in your notebook. Scratch your head like it's long division. I imagine there'll be quite a crowd this year. Last year, half the contestants were on the other side of the midway watching a retired carny bend himself into a pretzel when I proclaimed the winner. Not to worry, I'll be close at hand, sitting in the front row next to Penelope. I've been forgiven. She'll squeeze my hand and whisper in my ear. He wouldn't, would he? I'll wonder too, but I'll never admit it. When a sizable puddle has formed below the glass, it's time to pick the winner. Stand. Ask yourself one last time if she's worth it. Decide. So congratulations, Sally, on your third place. This story, I think Amanda and I must have read this about 5-6 times each.
More than that. Mm-hmm.
It's a puzzle of a story, and that's what I found really interesting about it. And I think you have to actually read this story and not just listen to it. But the clue is in the title. So it's a guide to judging the pie entries at the Women's Auxiliary Club from last year's judge who should have known better. And so now we have a new judge on the scene. And this story is told from the perspective of last year's judge, speaking mentally, presumably, to the new judge who's going through the motions.
Putting this in writing would be pretty awkward.
Yeah, and so in the subtext here, we get a lot of hints into what's happened in the past year, and there is some indication, perhaps, of adultery between the past judge, who presumably is married to Mrs. Henderson, and Ms. Prine, who is the surprise winner and the reigning champion for last year. And we're not sure, reading this, if it is an adulterous situation. There is that implication in the blue ribbon that's being pinned.
Like a scarlet letter sort of thing.
Yeah, and on whose breast you'll be pinning that ribbon. So, I mean, it's kind of implied there's all this innuendo and subtext. There's like the flirtatious look. And we're not sure if it is about the affair or if it is just the betrayal of giving the pie championship to someone who isn't his wife.
Now, Ed sounds confused here, and this is after reading it a whole bunch of times, right? And so just today when we were deciding the shortlist, we were coming to the conclusion, well, I was certainly, like, I don't think this is really adultery. It feels like it because the husband has chosen someone else's pie, and that might have been because she was a bit flirty too, and he's been paying for it ever since with his wife. And she's finally forgiven him, but now, oh shit, we're coming up to it again. And so he's offering advice to the next presumably husband here. So we've got 3 Mrs. Pie contestants and then 1 Ms. But this is a lot of work for the reader to be doing. And I argue often to let the reader do some of the work. That's why we say show, don't tell, like let the reader bring their own interpretation. But what I struggled with here and what potentially would have left it off the shortlist, but ultimately overcame by the other quality factors, was like, I'm still not 100% confident what's going on here. And I think this is what's interesting. So we've just gone hard on the fact that we don't get it. And yet this story has made it to third place.
Yeah.
Right? So what's that about? I don't know. Is this like a fuckboy situation where it's like, I can change you? It's like you've got the Riz.
Yeah.
And there's something that we both really liked about it. And I think it was that there was these two stories going on, right?
Yeah.
So it wasn't just the pie contest. It was also this other thing, which we're still not quite sure what it was, but we get a gist
There's
of what
enough
it was.
to know kind of what happened.
Yeah, there's enough to know that it's juicy. In fact, maybe it's that very fact of like the gossip.
Yeah.
You know, and you're just like, oh, I've got to know more. That makes it compelling. We did say it was difficult to pick the shortlist because there were strengths and weaknesses. And so I would say that the weakness of this story was the clarity.
Yep.
But the strengths of the story overcame that weakness, and ultimately we loved it because it was well written, because it had a great ending, because it had more going on under the surface, not just a surface level story, and because it was a whole story, a cohesive piece altogether. So thank you, Sally, for the mystery. Love a good mystery.
In second place, Everyone's a Winner by Sam James. I've got bogeys for days. Picking my nose is a bit like hook a duck. Everyone's a winner. I really can't stress that enough. I could poke around in there for hours on end and still there would be treasures to find. My particular penchant used to be to go mining whenever the news was on. You might not remember, but the news used to be so bleak. The energy crisis continues. Food shortages across the world worsen. There's not enough to go round. And I found that picking my nose was a comfort to me. The women I've dated over the years have found it variously nauseating, repulsive, and revolting. The whole gamut of disgust, really. But where others saw a gross habit, Lucy saw potential. Where does it all come from? She asked one day. She was pushing the tip of my nose up and staring directly into the depths of my nostrils. It's got to come from somewhere. It just doesn't make sense. We should measure it. And so I began to collect the stuff and weigh it. Once, I pulled out more than a kilogram of mucus over the course of a day. There was still more up there when I gave up and went to bed. After that, Lucy's fascination turned to concern, and she took me to see some specialists. I'm at a loss to explain your overabundance, the ENT doctor admitted, but I don't think it's a health risk. I'm similarly stumped, the biologist added. There's simply no anatomical mechanism that could account for that much snot. The laws of thermodynamics suggest this shouldn't be possible, but I wondered the physicist. I suppose it might. We'd have to run some tests. So we ran some tests, endoscopes, MRIs, Geiger counters. There wasn't an instrument available to science that didn't get aimed at my schnoz. Do you realise what this means? Lucy practically bounced when we got the test results back. This is going to change the world. And she was right. I have a wormhole up my nose. Why do I have a wormhole up my nose? Where does the other end of the wormhole come out? And why does the other end of the wormhole appear to contain an infinite supply of bogeys? I don't have any of the answers. But as a result of Lucy's insight, the news is much nicer nowadays. The energy crisis is solved because we have enough fuel to burn in the form of dried bogeys. And food shortages are a thing of the past because we have enough to eat in the form of don't think about it. For the first time in human history, there's not enough to go around.
Hey. Like, this is obviously totally ridiculous. First of all, I love that this is the pick a winner, pick a nose, right? That's great. But you didn't just pick the nose. You went so far beyond into literally like another universe.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that extreme take. Like, I do think flash fiction lends itself to the extremes. But it wasn't just extreme for the sake of extreme either. There was this link back to sort of where we're at now. So we start off with, I started picking my nose because the news was so bleak and we had an energy crisis and a food shortages. And then that's resolved. in the end. And that's resolved by this wormhole nose. And while it's silly, it's also kind of poignant because it's really stressful. It's really stressful to live in a world where there's all this negative shit going on. And it's kind of nice to latch onto the idea that it could be solved by a wormhole up a nose.
Yeah.
Because it really brings light into what can sometimes feel like a really dark situation. Like, it's a pretty common human experience right now to get so depressed and overwhelmed by the news. So this counterpoint, this fun, silly, stupid counterpoint is a really nice antidote to that. And so it feels like a breath of fresh air.
Yeah. It is undoubtedly a stupid story. And I think we wanted to showcase a story that just kind of went with its idea and ran with it, especially one that leaned very heavily into one of our prompts.
But we've got to number 2, right? And so people might be saying, okay, you're telling me this is a stupid story. Why did it get to number 2? And the reason is because this is one of those ones that actually we weren't 100% sure would even make it to the shortlist, let alone make it so high. But in the end, yes, it's a silly concept, but it's executed really well. Like, I don't have a lot of notes in terms of the writing style and how it could be improved. Like, I think the writing itself is really sound. So it's possible to take a silly idea and just do a really good job of it.
Yeah.
And I think that that's what this story did. So congratulations, Sam. And now, the moment we've all been waiting for. The winner of the April 2024 Not Quite Right prize for flash fiction is Unsay Anything by Chad Frame. Maybe I will, I unsaid, and felt my hand again on your cheek, smoothing the red welt I'd just left. My arm pulled back. So why don't you take it all back then, you unsaid. I wish I'd never chosen you, I unsaid, and backed away from you into the doorway, tears snaking back up my face to vanish into the corners of my eyes. You swore for better or worse, you unsaid, and the picture frame lifted off the bedroom floor and back into your hand, the fractal glass shards fitting back into place like a seamless puzzle. In the frame, behind the glass, we were embracing, young, newlywed, naive, your face unshadowed by stubble, undaunted by drink, my eyes uncircled by darkness. We never fucking were, I unsaid. We're not those people anymore, you unsaid, and set the picture frame down on the bedside table. Don't walk away from me when I'm talking to you, I unsaid. I disappeared from the doorway. 5 years rewound like an old film reel. I unstormed out to my parents' house. You unbecame an alcoholic, your mouth like a Jim Beam factory, filling bottle after bottle with wood-charred bog water. I uncaught you. You unfucked your secretary when you thought I was still out at therapy. You unsaid it was a great idea. I unsaid I was falling apart and needed to talk to a professional. You unhit the bottle. We unmourned the loss. I sucked the screams back into my mouth, fell asleep in a pool of clotted blood. You unwore me down. It's a name that works for any gender. You uninsisted. You wanted Robin. We unposted the announcement, caption unwritten, photo untaken, a rattle, a positive test, a tiny pair of shoes, a chalkboard with coming soon scrawled in careful cursive. At the corner of each word, the letter tails looped into hearts. The chalk traced back over the words, unscratched them from the slate, unetched the hearts. Tabula rasa. We unmoved into the house, packed our lives back into boxes, loaded them onto the truck, drove them back to our separate apartments where we unsharpied them, dishes, towels, books. We retreated from the altar. You pulled the ring from my finger, rose from one knee on a windswept beach. We vomited dinners back onto plates, every date unhappened, one by one undone. I choose you, I untold you lying in your arms. I unended things with my college boyfriend. I'm sorry, I untold Adam, tears snaking back up his handsome face to vanish into the corners of his bright eyes. I met someone else. Adam was the same in both directions, consistent, loving, stable. You were unpredictable, exciting, dangerous. At a party, you unhit on me, dark eyes full of mystery and promise. I'm Jake, you unintroduced yourself, cheeks undimpling as your grin disappeared. Everything stopped. Everything moves forward again. Fuck off, I yell over the music when you approach. You don't even get a word out. I'm happy with my boyfriend.
So well done, Chad. And we should point out that Chad was actually second place in the last round of the competition. It's like hitting it out of the park right now.
Truly.
So obviously this is really leaning into the anti-prompt, and the explanation from Chad was the opposite of said. It isn't using other dialogue tags. It's unsaying things. It's sucking the words back into your mouth as your life unravels around you. And it was a unique approach. There was no one else who took this approach. And I liked the way that the story was told, all the details about like what's presumably a miscarriage and, you know, what comes out of that, the therapy and the affair and all of that. There's a lot of subtext again in this one and very delicately handled, I think, and unique. And it really was a standout for both of us.
Yeah, like I think sometimes this kind of angle can feel...
It can feel like a gimmick, I guess.
Yeah, but it didn't feel like that here. And clearly because it was a take on the anti-prompt, we could see what you were trying to do, and so that was part of it. But also it felt more poignant that way. Like if you had told this story the other way around, you know, from start to finish, it would have felt like too big of a picture. Like you're trying to tell me an entire life story in a flash fiction. But in reverse, what it feels more like is this reflection on the very specific red flags almost, or the very specific moments in a relationship where things went wrong. And I feel like that's more powerful told in reverse. So it really worked this way. And it definitely did stand out for that creative take, but also because it's this complete holistic story from start to finish, or from finish to start maybe in this case, where some big stakes, like we did say, generally speaking in this round, it was quieter, that things were a bit more subdued. In this case, there's some really big shit going on.
Yeah.
And the consequences are pretty dire. And that's very evident.
And each of these little points in the life, Chad has chosen some really good moments to highlight. It's all of these really tiny moments.
They're turning points, right?
Yeah.
Like it's where the narrative just shifts quite starkly for this couple. And there's some beautiful lines like 5 years rewound like an old film reel.
Yeah.
So this winding back up, like you can almost hear that old school rewind sound effect, right? As this story is being told. And it does contribute to, if I say it again, post single effect. This rewind that we're experiencing is evident throughout this whole piece. And it's not just there. It feels like you're rewinding. Like I'm feeling myself being rewound into this story. And that's a really compelling feeling. Like I'm not distracted out of that. Like I am in that the whole time. Also, the dialogue here was really cutting and gripping. Like it wasn't just he said, she said. It's the worst things you can say to each other. And that's the shit you remember in a relationship. Like there was worst stuff.
A lot of drama.
So one of my favorite lines from this story is, we vomited dinners back onto plates. Every date unhappened, one by one undone. We're already sort of rewinding, and then that just like ups the ante. Like we vomited dinners back onto plate. Like just
it's
the
very
escalation.
visual.
And at that point in the story when we're nearing the climax, that was a really powerful upping of the ante. And just the the use of I uncaught you, you unfucked your secretary. That has so much more power than you fucked your secretary and I caught you. It's like the 2020 hindsight coming back and just like how hard those things hit is more evident in hindsight than it could possibly be at the time. Yeah. And I think too, some of these images, like the idea of a posted announcement with a rattle and a photo and a positive test, like it's just so hopeful and it's almost cliche, but it's something we're all familiar with. And so to rewind that back, it's just this like starting point of shit going wrong is quite powerful.
And we get it after it goes wrong. So, we get to reflect on that fact. I think it worked really well, and well done, Chad. That's 2 occasions I think that we've kind of said you've challenged us and you've not gone with a traditional story, a traditional narrative, a traditional structure, and it's worked for you both times. So well done, Chad. Congratulations on your win. There will be 1,000 Australian dollars heading your way and a shiny new trophy.
But I just want to say thank you so much to everyone who participated in the competition. We read each and every one of your stories and enjoyed them all. And I wish we could reward them all, but then it wouldn't be so exciting if you got on the long list. So what can you do? But for those of you who did make the long list, for those of you who made the shortlist, won a cash prize, like congratulations. You really did something to stand out from the pack and you should be proud of yourselves. And I hope it gives you a little boost to keep writing because that's what we're all here to do. And I also hope that you will join us again. So our next comp is in July. Plenty of time to fill the well and get some more creative juices flowing for some more ideas and another new anti-prompt challenge. If you've signed up for a critique, we'll be delivering those over the coming weeks. And also when you do get your critique, we hope you'll share it in the forum, like share what you've learned, chat about this stuff because from our perspective, that's what we're here for. Like we want to make this a joint learning experience, including for us as well.
And we'll be back in the forum soon as well. So let us know what you think about the results. How did you go? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you hate us?
It's all subjective. So we're fully prepared to continue the conversation.
Look, we love hearing from you guys in whatever form on social media. Shoot us an email. Let us know what you think about literally anything. We'll probably talk about it on the podcast. And we'll probably wrap it up right there because it's 2 a.m. and we've been recording for literally 12 hours.
But also like I've been working on this shit since I got up at 6 a.m.
Yeah. It's been
so
a long,
it's nearly 24 hours. It's 20 hours.
Yeah. So we're looking forward to getting back into our regular episodes soon. And we hope that you'll stick around. And until then, ride on.
That's what he said.
Thank you for listening to Not Quite Right. If you'd like to reach us via email or follow us on social media, you can find all the links on our website, notquiterightpodcast.com. That's WRITE. And if you enjoyed the show, we'd love it if you could leave us a 5-star review on your favourite podcasting app.
Something doesn't seem quite right.
Mr. Prince? I'm Victoria, the nurse.
Oh, she said it's sexier than that.
Mr. Prince. The nurse announced, breezing into the room. I'm here to fit your sling.
Sexy.
Here to fit your sling. It doesn't fit. Victoria was wearing faded blue scrubs with a fresh stain that was an unusual shade of yellow. Her hair...
Urine yellow. But like weird urine.
Or pus. You can't spell pussy without pussy.